The next panel is Glenville from a youth perspective. Is that right? Is that where we are now?
We were youth, we were maps.
Oh, well, y'all, okay, I was, you know.
I'm like, the youth are tomorrow.
Okay, so,
At the time of the riot,
so these are the young people when they were in Glenville, okay.
I
didn't want to say anything.
I told her to tell you.
So, let's see.
Oh, I'm still young.
Okay, so I want to, so y'all all grew up in Glenville then, right? Okay, so let's just start. Again, introduce yourself when called upon, or what was it like growing up we heard from a panel of the elders who were elders even at that time, or young people, millennials, you couldn't call them, or whatever. But what was it like growing up as a young person in Glenville? My sister graduated from Glenville High School, but tell us what it was about for you.
So at the time, I'm Catherine Hall.
And stand up, because again, we're having some challenges.
Okay. I'm Catherine Hall, and I grew up in Glenville on 113th and Superior. My mom still lives in the house that we grew up in. And so at the time all of this was happening, I was 9 years old. And so my first recollection of so I'll start with what the neighborhood was for a 9-year-old. As from my perspective, the neighborhood was beautiful. We had stores on every block. It was a mixed population of Jewish individuals and African Americans. I was 9, so I didn't have any understanding of the racial kinds of things that were going on. My family was from Pennsylvania, so I never had that Southern discrimination experience. I just didn't. So as a 9-year-old growing up in the neighborhood, I could go anywhere I wanted to go. 105 was like Christmas with the lights and the restaurants and all the people. And everybody in your neighborhood knew you. And it was just a great place to grow up. And then I'm sure we'll get to how that changed instantly. But for a 9-year-old in my neighborhood, from 113 up to the bus barn where the little store, your big store was, it felt like New York City, because we had the run of the place, everybody was friendly, we had a chance to shop wherever we wanted to go, we rode our bikes everywhere, and it was just a great neighborhood to grow up in. And everyone on our street, and some of my neighbors are here, our street was like a family. Your neighbors, my mom worked, my dad worked, and so my neighbors' parents would get you. Everybody looked out for each other. The street was like your family. And we just had a great experience until.
Hello, and before I start, I would like to ask your permission for me to speak, for I realize that hadn't been done today.
Yeah.
Do I have your permission?
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that I have to say is I was a teenager at that time. And my name is Vincent Holland. You hear people sometimes call me Dr. Vincent Holland, but if you hear people from the neighborhood, they'll call me Bull, because that was my nickname back then. So that's the one that actually I bumped into somebody who knew me from the old neighborhood. For me, I was born actually in an attic in Glenville, lived there for the first 2 years of my life. I don't remember that, but what I do remember is by the time I was 10 and 11, my mother was the athletic director of Glenville Y. I would get on the 10 bus almost every day after junior high school and travel all the way across town because I could play ball and swim and do everything else I wanted to. Walking to and from Glenville, I could go to almost any restaurant. There was a sit-down restaurant. Most of them were family restaurants. Yeah. So even if they had hours, they'd open the doors later and earlier for you. The other thing, and it's the very same thing that you mentioned, not only did we have an issue with education, we had an issue with community. Sorry, what's that? Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Let me grab.
Is it turned on?
Let me get in the middle. I'll grab the microphone. Not only do we have an issue with the neighborhood where everybody knew each other, we also had an issue where people would ask. And when people talked about the underground economy, the other thing I noticed in the neighborhood is everybody was respectful to women.
Yeah.
When you walk through, they would say, yes, ma'am, yes, no. The other thing, too, is everybody would also refer to almost all the males by their last name, because where they worked, nobody else did. So it was Mr. Holland, Mr. Jones, Mr. Williams. The other thing, too, is there was a tremendous amount of pride in who had the best yard.
Yes.
And it's one thing I noticed about Glenville. When you went there, people planted flowers. Almost every neighborhood had a fruit tree. By the way, we knew when every fruit tree bloomed because we used to rate them.
Right.
And I think the other thing, too, that we missed in the neighborhood is quite oftentimes when we went to school, when I was in my other neighborhood, the teachers walked with us. When I talked to people in Glenville, a lot of the people lived in the neighborhood. You could walk out the house and walk to a doctor. You could walk out the house and walk to a business person. When you talk about people with what we did, basically people would ask this question, hey, who's hiring? And you could get an answer where you could walk to that in the neighborhood. Let me turn this over to you. Thanks.
Very good, very good. Rita, you want to say something? Come on up here, sis. All right.
Well, actually, I don't need that.
You don't need that. All right.
I'm from Glenville, which is thank you. Rita Knight Gray. He already said that, and there goes my phone. But anyway, I moved to Glenville in 1959. I was 10 years old. We lived on 112th Street from Superior to Ashbury, which I deemed the other side of University Circle. And actually, it's the same area in which the shootout took place. When going to Rosedale Elementary School, which was on 115th, which is no longer there, was my first time experiencing a mixed school, because I had come from 64th and Quincy, and I went to John Burroughs Elementary School. Oh, that one's not working? I had come from John Burroughs Elementary School, and when my parents moved up to 112, you can't hear me? No. Wow.
It's bad acoustics.
Somebody told me it was good acoustics when I questioned some people. Okay, went to John Burroughs Elementary School, came to East 112th Street, went to Rosedale. The neighborhood was like a village, which I think was happening in everybody's neighborhood. You couldn't skip school or cut because there was either a Miss Green or Miss Brown or Miss Black who would be sitting in the window because they were home taking care of the kids, or they were just home. And when your mother got off the bus, because my mother worked downtown, and when she got off the Superior bus, walking up 112, if I ever was home and it wasn't time for me to be home, she would be told by the time she reached the house. Yes. So when we went to high school, and I didn't go to Glenville because I lived on the other side, I went to John Hay. The best thing about it, and I'll go that way, the best thing about going to John Hay, because it was the #1 business school in the city of Cleveland, and they were changing it over at that time to a regular high school. So for people who couldn't get the monies together if they were going to graduate to go to college, you could get a great career at John Hay, which when I graduated on June the 14th, that following Monday, I think it was the 17th, I already had a job. And I took that route because my parents, I understood that there was no money. So I took that route to make sure that if I did go to school, I could work anywhere and do anything to get myself through that. But like I said, when we were in high school, we were all trying to figure out how to leave school. And everybody would say, let's go over to your house. And of course, I'd say no, because Miss Green is in the window. And then somebody else said, well, how about your house? And the person would say, I don't think so, You know Miss Brown is always home. So what we ended up doing was going to Case. We'd go and cut at Case. We'd go to the art museum. We'd have lunch with the students at the cafeteria. And then we go back to school. So what I'm trying to say is it was a pleasurable neighborhood to be in during that time period. The one thing I know, people were talking about the police. I don't know if anybody remembers, but there were two African-American officers. One was called Brown, and I can't think of the other. Could be. But they were the ones that sort of ruled Glenville in regards to black young men. They were the ones that if they saw you doing the wrong thing, they'd hem them up in the corner, tell them what would be done if they were somebody else, and also explain that I know your mother. And after that was done, the young men sort of slithered away into the corner somewhere and pretended like they didn't do anything and was never going to do it again. So basically, I'm just talking about the good times we had until we get to the other parts and what basically happened in a neighborhood that was really good during that time from 59 up until 1960, and how I saw how things fell into the toilet, so to speak. Thank you.
First, I want to say thanks to everyone who's come out to kind of reminisce with those of us who used to live in the Glenville area. I don't know that I have a lot that I can add other than when Janice said this would be from a youthful perspective, I had to laugh because I was 6 years old in 1968. But what I can tell you, just remembering through the eyes of a 6-year-old, my brother and I would walk down the street. We could go to the store by ourselves. As a matter of fact, my father was a jazz musician, and he would come home in the afternoon and give my brother and I each a dime, where we could go around the corner to Mr. Blackman's, who had a store. I remember Deering's. I remember Franklin's ice cream, which was always a really great treat for us. I had grandparents who lived on Elberon, which is up the road on Superior, but Superior was we lived in a neighborhood. You know, I hear people talk about the hood. They took the neighbor out of hood. We lived in a neighborhood. You knew everyone. Kids played together really well. I can say that remembering through the lens of a 6-year-old, I think about the first time I saw the Black Nationalists and how proud I was to see. I don't even know that I knew it was pride that I was feeling, but watching all of these young black men stand at attention, the cadence of their march. I remember after the riot, I remember during the riots where we had to lay on the floor, turn the lights off and lay on the floor. This is from a 6-year-old, had no idea what was going on. I can remember days after the riot, we would walk to a store which was called Save More on 105th off of Superior. And you remember Save More? Yeah. So there was a lady named Daisy who worked at Save More, and whenever we hit the door, she had candy. So we always wanted to go, and there were just so many wonderful things to do. There was Greater Abyssinia Church and Corey Methodist Church, where there were programs for young folks like myself, those that were older, art classes and that sort of thing. But what I can say that I remember most about Glenville, it was that we were all embraced. I attended Doane Elementary School until the 6th grade. I remember the library that was on 105th. I won my first award, Creative Writing Award there, and an award for reading the most books during the summer. Those are the types of things that went on in our area. But one other thing that I want to say, and especially to the young lady who just graduated from Glenville, my mother always believed that you did not abdicate the education of your culture to other people. So even though they had Black history classes in school, we were taught that stuff at home. And that's something that I think is sorely missing. We have kids now, and when I say kids, I mean even those that are 20 and 21, they really have no idea about what we have all gone through collectively and what we are going to be facing collectively if we don't get our stuff together. We have to do more than sit and talk about it and continue to meet about it and rehash and look at old pictures. I don't have an answer, but I know that I have the desire for things to be different, and I'm willing to step up and do my part. But other than that, I guess if you guys had other questions about things in Glenville, there were some things that I could probably remember. But again, through the lens of a 6-year-old, I had a father that said he was a jazz musician. He played Leo's Casino, Club 101. I remember 105. I just remember it being a place where it was a family opportunity. It was, my grandparents lived in the area. I had aunts and uncles that lived in the area. So we were really a community/family from so many different perspectives. Education was something that was heralded. I didn't know anyone who dropped out of school. I didn't even know that was an option, that you couldn't go to school or that you didn't go, it was just, but again, it's a mindset, it's a perception. This is what I remember most about Glenville. And even though I don't live there now, I moved away 5 years or so ago, Glenville will always be my home. It'll always be a place that I remember fondly. And one other thing I want to add, and this came a little bit after the riots, but there was the first Muslim bakery was on 105th and Superior, where I believe there is now a library and a bank, or there used to be a bank. And I remember the smell of fresh donuts every single day wafting through the area. But it was a beautiful place. I believe it still is a beautiful place. And I believe that we can bring it back, maybe not to the place that it was, but to elevate it to a higher level of consciousness if we really have the desire and we put the intention and put forth to do so. Okay?
Okay, I wanted to ask the panel, what was it like? Do any of you remember as children what happened that night? I'm going to be saying something about it in a few minutes, but does anybody remember? Yeah, go ahead.
So I remember being at home, and my cousin was visiting us from Pennsylvania, and we had had a really great time doing some things in the neighborhood and going to some parks and things. And so my dad, he worked a second job. He was a graduate of Baldwin Wallace College, and he was a teacher, but he also worked at the group home. And so he came home one night, it was about 11 o'clock, so we were in bed, and he was, just shaken up. And he said, "You guys are all in here asleep, and the neighborhood is burning down around you." And we're looking at each other like, "What do you mean?" And so we all run up to we had a 2-family house, and we ran up to the attic, and I remember looking out the window in each direction, and all you saw was fire. All you saw was fire. And you heard sounds from a 6-year-old's perspective, what I now know were gunshots, but I'd never heard that before. And so then I know my whole world changed, because after that, we weren't allowed out of the house. It might have been a month before we were allowed on Superior. We lived on 113th and Superior. And what was commonplace for us to go all over that part of Superior was no more. And I remember the first time that we were in the car with my dad and we went down Superior, I was just dumbfounded. It looked like a war zone. The places that have been near and dear to our hearts and cherished. There was one of the things we all didn't talk about in our neighborhood. There were actually black stores and black-owned businesses. There were Muslim bakeries. There was a mix of neighborhood facilities. So it wasn't just Jewish facilities, but it was a mixture of Jewish businesses and African American businesses. And I just remember that first time coming out of the house and going down Superior, it looked like a war zone. And I didn't understand it as a kid, because that wasn't a conversation that my parents were having with a 6-year-old. But life as I knew it had changed dramatically after that. And when things settled down and you were able to walk, You just remember going, well, that used to be here, it's not here anymore. And that used to be here and it's not here anymore. And where did the people go that were nice to us when we went in those particular stores? And what happened? So from my perspective, it was just like night and day. It didn't feel safe anymore. You kept thinking it might happen again, and you were wondering what happened because nobody was having that conversation with a 6-year-old.
Pass the mic.
I came to the experience as a teenager, young teenager. And in coming to it, there are a couple of things that you never capture in books. You can't capture the smell of what went on because it was charcoal fire. You can't capture the words that went on. We realized gunshots were fired, but I guarantee you will never count the number of gunshots because it was constant. The other thing, too, is when you get around to it, the insurrection will hit you in every single sense you had, verbal, physical. For a lot of people, emotional, taste, because restaurants closed down, people couldn't get to food. And one thing that people miss is how many people stepped up to help during that time. Because there are people who had babies, who other people went out knowing that they could be in some kind of situation to get that. For me, I also remember the fact that on the second day, my mother was the athletic director at Glenville Y. The Y closed down. On the second day, a military truck drove into our yard on Mount Pleasant Boulevard on the other side of town. And this is where I started learning what the military was. The person who jumped out was my father's boss, who was a National Guard during the weekend. We had nothing but, shall we say, amateur soldiers watching a community, many of them playing soldier. The fields where we played were taken over by tanks and vehicles. And that became an issue because, unfortunately, the way we looked became a way of suspicion for everybody. And one of the things back then that people miss is you had to carry your selective service card with you. If you did not have it, that was grounds to be arrested, and usually it was 15 days in the county when you got that. So a lot of us realized not only did they police space, they policed giving you records without records. And that still continues.
I had just graduated from John Hay and was waiting to attend Kent State University. That fall would be my first year there. And we were all sitting on the porch, steps and everything, and doing something because we were already 18. So staying out late wasn't a problem. And then all of a sudden, I heard shots. Then I heard sirens. And then one of the guys that lived down the street, he ran out to see what was going on. And he came back and told us, because I wasn't going down that way. I could smell various things burning. The shots were in the distance, so to speak, because I lived on 112th, but it was around Oroville, which is, if you took Oroville over to Beulah, you would be right into the middle of it. So you could hear everything, smell everything. You can even see some of the fires if you were on the second floor of your house, or if you went up to the attic to take a look. The next day, we ventured down to see what it looked like. And the Eagle Market that was on 115th was gone. The A&P that was further down the street, closer to around 109th, it was gone. Some of the stores in between were gone. We tried to get over to 123rd, but we couldn't get over that way. They weren't letting people over that way. So since we knew the neighborhood, we were able to take the trip that I just said. We went back home, went through Oroville, went down Beulah, and we were on Lakeview, looking at everything that was going on. I was so interested in getting back to going to school that it didn't affect me, I think, the way it affected other people. I think I was looking at it and saying I was glad I was getting out of it because I was going to go to another adventure, but I was sad because everything was gone. It wasn't the same place. I mean, I remember coming home from John Hay, and all of us, it was like 3 of us girls, walking down Superior, and we were in intramurals, and basically a gym leader who directed some of the gym classes, some of the leadership skills I got when I was going to John Hay. So we were all coming home because we all lived not too far from each other. And we were walking by ourselves and everything. And I remember that because after what happened in 1968, wasn't doing that. The population dropped. I mean, it really dropped. Some of the people that I knew that I used to hang around, we had graduated, they went off to college, but then when they came back, they weren't living in Glenville. The areas, it was like somebody had a balloon and they stuck a pin into it, and there was nothing. It was just really dead. I stayed at school a lot because I didn't drive, so I couldn't get home, and I think that was one saving grace, but not really. You started clinging to some of the businesses that were still there, and I remember one of the businesses, which was Star Barbecue on 123rd, which made the original Cleveland Polish boy. I don't know what the rest of these places make, but because I'd be on campus at Kent, and one of my friends would say, I feel like a Polish boy, so we drive from Kent past my house, because I lived on 112, to go over to Stars and pick up some Polish boys and then drive back to Kent. So you sort of hung on to what was there and tried to see what could be done. I mean, I only stayed at Kent in '69 because you all know what happened on May 4th. So I was back home in Glenville, and I noticed after people started leaving, there were a lot of people that used to, I think Mr. Freeman said something about professionals. A lot of the professionals left, which left a lot of people that really didn't know what to do with themselves, didn't trust anybody, and wasn't interested in doing anything except going to work, getting the money to pay for whatever, and hoping their kids would graduate from school. It got worse because we had the crack issue, and we lost 2 generations with kids growing up with crack parents or growing up with their grandparents, and nobody getting any information or education about who and what we were, or about how to solve the problem. The biggest situation I remember was the whole redlining. Now, redlining was already going on, but the area I lived in where there was the shootout got extra redlining. And maybe I'm going too far? Okay. In the area that I live in, which was from 123rd, but Glenville stretched from 125th and Superior all the way over to Ashbury, down to 105th, and back over to Ashbury. So I lived in that area. And that area was supposed to be part of Glenville, but it was also pushed with University Circle. So when I got back to from California, God, I'm jumping, but I went to California for 5 years, and when I got back, there were grants and everything was given to all the different areas, Fairfax, Central, Huff, Glenville, except the area from 125th and Superior to 105th, back over to Ashbury not including, there were no grants because we were assumed to be part of the university circle. So when people needed money to fix their houses, they could not get loans. When businesses wanted to come in or people that were just wanting to start businesses, they could not get loans. And that happened from the time of the 1968 uprising until 1980, late 80s to the 90s, until there was White, Voinovich and White, because the values of the houses were like 17,000 to 20,000. And in order for you to fix it, you needed almost a $50,000 loan. So since you had no value, you could not get a loan. A lot of things happened during that time, and I don't want to take up too much, but I think other people have other things. But I was an older person that went from the younger part of Glenville, from the 1959s, all the way up through now, which I still live in my parents' house after I got back, and still talking about the whole situation of what's going on now and really trying to educate people in regards to that. Thank you.
Okay, I want to maybe ask the panel the question, what happened after the insurrection? I mean, what was the neighborhood like? I mean, we've heard this idea of, like you said, neighborhood. What happened after? You know, what was the neighborhood like after the insurrection? Anybody want to start on that?
Go ahead. Again, this is through the lens of a 6-year-old. I can remember the first thing that caught my attention was being on the street looking at a tank. Never seen a tank before. We couldn't park on the street. There were the little horses they put up at the end when they block a street off. There were holes in the street. There were houses where people that I knew lived that were partially burned out. I didn't feel a sense of joy anymore. We were not allowed to play outside alone by ourselves. We had to play in groups, and we couldn't go any further than maybe 2 or 3 houses down either way. We were not allowed to be out of my parents' sight for any length of time. As a matter of fact, I can remember my mom, we had a babysitter at that point. I remember my grandmother would walk from her house, which she lived on Lamont in the Huff area, and she would walk to 105th where Doane was to pick my brother and I up from school. We just couldn't, it was just a sense that, I guess for me, it was a little bit more authority involved. There were things that my brother and I were so used to doing on our own and alone. And then we have friends in the neighborhood. So I share the same birth date as your niece, Sarah Bevel, and her mom was our kindergarten teacher. The Pecks, who lived in Way Park, well, still live on Way Park, very good friends of mine. I just think about a lot of people that I knew and how families sort of just begin to embrace their kids more. And honestly, we started doing things outside of the neighborhood because there was really nothing left in the neighborhood to kind of hang on to, at least from my perspective as a young child. I do remember that from a kid's perspective, we couldn't trick or treat anymore. We would get together in huge groups and everybody on the street would go trick or treating. Just those little things that, you know, sort of gives you your foundation for your childhood, the things that you can do that you have freedoms to do. We couldn't do anymore. I couldn't walk down to Deering's alone or to Franklin's Ice Cream. And I keep saying that because I don't know what happened to Franklin's Ice Cream, but it was sort of like the best ice cream ever from a kid's perspective. I remember that we would get a dime and we could get 2 cherries or 2 pieces of candy for a penny. So for me, that was fabulous, you know. Just the little things that kids, you know, sort of, I guess, take for granted. But I think as I look back from an adult perspective, what do you do in situations like that? I didn't know, and I don't know, both of my parents have passed on now, so I can't ask them. I don't know if there was any type of counseling for people who lived in that area. I don't know if there were, I guess maybe ward committees or people who got together to talk about what happened, to really dig deep to see what it was that we could do. You know, because technically I kind of felt like we were being assaulted. People always say it was a shootout, and that sounds, that has a whole Western connotation, you know, TV feel. It wasn't a shootout. You know, it wasn't an uprising in that perspective. You know, when people have to protect themselves, what are they going to do? You know, you're living by the amendments and the laws of this Constitution, but do they really protect you or support what you do and how you move forward? So again, from a 6-year-old perspective, I had parents who were very honest with me to tell me what was going on. And maybe a couple years later, Angela Davis's book, If They Come in the Morning, I remember my mother telling me, this is one book that you have to read. I couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, but I was being introduced to the concepts that we all need to embrace if we're gonna free ourselves up from what we've been dealing with forever, almost like forever, you know. So I don't know that I have a lot more to add. Again, 6 years old, but as I look back, it solidly set my focus on who I am and how I move forward and how I interact in community and with other people. And I'm very proud to be a Black woman at this time in this country and in this world. And my mother taught me to be a world citizen. So there's nowhere that I should not be able to go and be able to stand strong and stand proud. And you shouldn't let a neighborhood that you lived in or used to live in stop you from having pride about who you are. So again, my hat is off to everybody who came out to celebrate this 50th anniversary. We have some deep roots and deep history all over the city of Cleveland. Every community should come together on some level and have these conversations, and then maybe collectively we could get together and come up with a solution on how we can start moving in the right direction.
We're asking about how things changed.
So obviously I grew up. We had just purchased a home in the neighborhood, and so we stayed. And so what I learned from going from being oblivious and having a wonderful life, you know, just like the movie, things changed. I learned, I started going to school and learning more about the civil rights movement. It was starting to be taught in the classroom. It was curriculum, and whereas before it was conversation. And so I then learned what it meant as a little Black girl to be a Black girl and everybody didn't like you. And just the struggles, some of the history that I had not been aware of, you talk about, and I agree with most folks who have said that. I think one of the biggest deterrents in where we are today is that we have not taught our children our history. We've dropped the ball on that. You can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. And we've allowed other people to let us drop that ball. And so I noticed that I started learning a lot about civil rights. And one particular thing struck me. I remember as a kid, a few years later, washing the dishes, and I heard my mom scream, and I dropped this dish and it broke. And she said, "They killed him, they killed him." And I was like, who? I knew it, you know, another jolt to the system, but that was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I remember going to school the next day, and it was all about us and our history, you know, for months thereafter. But as people say, it touched your life. I know that what I went through as a child was the impetus for what I have done my whole life, which has been diversity, affirmative action, and equal opportunity. But it started with those jolts as a child and learning who I really was, although we had not been affected, so I thought, immediately growing up in that neighborhood. And I've chosen to move back into the Glenville neighborhood. My mom still lives on the street that I grew up. And as I was listening to folks tell their story, I was looking at the neighborhood in my mind from when I was 6 years old to today. And what I do know is that there were things that were taken away during that era that never came back. There are vacant blocks or vacant lots that had wonderful things on them when I was a child. And although the neighborhood has partially come back, you can still see those as reminders of what happened during that time. So.
And you know, it's also how Cleveland itself has changed. I remember 105th, every time my father would drive us past 105th and Euclid, he would always point to the traffic light there and say, you know who put that traffic light up there? And it was Garrett Morgan. And every time, I don't care if we passed that 100 times a day, he would tell us that. So I remember Garrett Morgan from when I couldn't remember. And I think the city in general, somebody told me before the meeting that, and I don't know if this is true, but I'm just saying what I was said, that university hospitals and Cleveland Clinic, there's only 2 independent hospitals left in the city, St. Vincent and was one more. Is that true? Yeah. See, I remember Mount Sinai, I remember St. Luke's, I remember a whole lot of hospitals. And it's amazing how we know that 105th and Euclid was like a center, and 105th and Superior as a center of the black community that, you know, held us together, and they're gone. But that's a whole nother discussion. Okay, let's take 2 questions, and we're gonna hear about the reporting that took place during that period. Any questions from the audience? 2 questions, right here, bro.
For example, like 9/11, the country comes together.
9/11, the country comes together.
In a time of crisis. But it seems like in the black community, oftentimes we come together, we come together in crisis. But in this situation, everyone's saying it hasn't happened. The neighborhood was deflated. Why is that?
Did everybody hear that question? Here, say that. Stand up and say the question, bro. I know you filming, but, you know, say the question.
In time of crisis, the country comes together, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11 or whatever, but in our community, it seems like we come together in crisis, oftentimes at funerals, things like that. But in this situation, she said the neighborhood was deflated, people were moving, businesses closed. It would seem like this would be an opportunistic time for the community to come together, but it didn't happen. Why is that?
Economics.
We hear economics. Go read it.
In actuality, it was economics, but not really. You got to think of the mindset of the people. I heard someone talking about, did we ever have psychologists come in and talk to us about the situation? We didn't have any of that. You also have to remember that it was also embarrassing. And the reason why is because it was the burning of some of the properties and the loss that was gone. It was embarrassing. So a lot of people didn't talk about it. A lot of people didn't even look at it as something to come together and talk about and say, what was the problem? Why didn't we do this? There was a lot of division in the sense of people only looking at it from the standpoint that, well, Evans brought it on himself. The police were right to remove them. You wouldn't believe some of the information that was coming out of some people's mouths, because it goes back to information. And I have to say that because I am a librarian and information is key. When nobody knows the truth, it becomes number 45's fake news. Because everybody makes up their own story. And everybody believes in another dimension that it's because of somebody else. So from my point of view of what I saw from the times that I was there, seeing that I was almost an adult, that's, in my mindset, that's what was going on. And from what I heard from other people, that was the case in point. Because no, everybody sort of tried to forget it. Everybody tried to remove it and think that they could go on, but not seeing that in the interim of all of that, it created nothing. It made something good really bad. Something that you loved wasn't there anymore.
And then we're gonna have one more.
Go ahead.
There are a couple things that actually do need to be stated in some ways. For example, there were the visible things you saw that took away from the community, but there were the invisible ones too. One of the things is there's no doubt when they started putting Buddhist centers into the community that drug use was much higher. We also know that when you look at it, they criminalized an entire population. And about maybe 8 years ago, somebody did a study of how many people were taken out of Glenville and put into our state prison system. For years, we've had many men who've gone down, costing us millions of dollars every year. Matter of fact, 12.5 in 2009. And the other thing, too, is when we talk about economics, economics was taken out of the neighborhood and changed in the neighborhood because values went down. People that put their life savings in houses disappeared. The other thing is there also were businesses where you could walk to, White Motors and the rest, where many people lived. All of those things got feet and left. And there's another thing that has to be looked at, too. How they started educating changed. It's amazing to talk to students now, talk about the fact they can't even get a book in class because it's not there. So quite oftentimes you have genius that's not allowed to be genius, and that's a very big problem, too. Thank you.
It's gonna be a short question. I can tell when this is all people be long.
The question has to do within the present. There's numerous efforts in terms of regentrification and spatial displacement, along with the former probation officer talk about criminalization from Cleveland Clinic, University Hospital, and Case Western Reserve, and then push back over to Ashbury, and to further remove indigent populations from those particular areas, and the visibility of replanting those. And what is your understanding, what is your feeling about even further the marginalization of the indigency in African Americans within that community and criminalization within the surrounding communities and the efforts to encroach and expand north of this area to Superior, on down past Chester to Huff, and on past Ashbury to Euclid, because it seems to be a bitronic push under the guise of benevolence in terms of issues around really what we would call some type of expropriation and over-policing from the University Hospital, Case Western Reserve Police, Cleveland Clinic Police Department, which all have their own law enforcement agencies within those particular areas. And the use of the rising property values and rental values in those particular areas that you just spoke of. Now, what is your understanding and what is your feeling about that as an African American for the further push of indigency out of those communities?
He's talking about gentrification,
I can tell you,
which is occurring all over the United States. You ought to come to Baltimore where I live, man.
I still live in Glenville.
You still live in Glenville.
I moved back.
How many of you still live in Glenville?
I moved back.
Yeah. Let me share you a quick story. I was doing my yard work in the yard, and a person pulled up to me and said, "Excuse me, do you know who owns this house?" Doing yard work in the house. And I said, "Yeah, I want to see how far the person would go with this." I said, "Do you know who the owner is?" It's the second time. I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm the owner," and he gave me the strangest look. I heard this house was for sale. I happen to live right across the street from the Cultural Gardens. The houses there are six-figure houses or more than that. We're finding out that there is a clear movement to basically move people out of the neighborhood, and for the elderly, the way they've been doing it is by overtaxing them for the houses. The other conversation that we're having is gentrification is a word that we need to rechange what it is, because it's not gentra and it's not vacation. It's take over locations. And we need to get to a point of understanding what that is. One quick other point, and I want to turn this over because I don't want to talk too much, I can sometimes talk too much, is the fact that when you talk about criminalization, University Circle had an African-American police chief who I knew well. They promoted him so they could put somebody in to change the attitudes of the police there. Because I know who trained him and I know where they did it.
I have a colleague of mine said we shouldn't call it gentrification, but ethnic cleansing, which is even a deeper question. And that's happening all over the United States. In Baltimore, where I live about 4 miles from where Freddie Gray was killed, and Sandtown, Winchester area where he was killed, and whites are moving into that area who can get loans just like that to fix up houses. Black folk have applied for loans to fix up those areas. They can't get the loans. So that redlining, even though formally it's gone, is still there with bankers all over this country.